What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Political Insider. I'm Brett Smith, your humble host. Joining me today is a good friend. He's the editor of BearingArms.com and the host of the 40 Acre Fool podcast. Cam Edwards, welcome.
Hey, Brett. How are you, man?
Good to see you. Thanks for being here. So we got some movement this week or this month on the Second Amendment. The left is making some big moves. First, we've got this ATF and the Biden administration with their new rule regarding stabilizing braces, and now we've got Governor Pritzker banning assault weapons across the state. For those that don't understand what the ATF has done with this new rule, explain what a stabilizing brace is and what it means to the average American who might own one.
Okay, so that's the easy part. When we get to what the ATF's doing, that's when it gets really complicated. But so basically, stabilizer braces are exactly that, right? They were a brace that attaches to the rear of a handgun that braces the firearm and provides more stability for the shooter. Mm-hmm. And the first brace that was submitted to the ATF, I think it was back in the early 90s. And the basic, design was meant to aid somebody who might have a little disability, right, and could use that extra support. So it was submitted to the ATF, and they asked, okay, does putting this brace on the back of a handgun turn that handgun into a short-barreled rifle, and which is an item that's covered by the National Firearms Act, right? So in order to possess one of those, you have to register with the government, you have to pay a $200 tax stamp, and if you don't, it's a felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
Wow.
So the ATF looked at this brace and said, no, that's doesn't make it a short barrel rifle. As long as it's, used as a brace, you're fine. So time goes on. These items become more popular, not just with those who might have a disability, but those who just think, wow, that's kind of cool, right? At the same time, you're seeing a growth in popularity of AR style pistols. So these are guns that, probably most gun owners would look at that and say, that looks like a mini AR-15, right? And it does kind of look like a cut down version of an AR-15, but it doesn't have the bump stock. The barrel length is not long enough to qualify as a rifle. So it's considered a handgun under federal law. Well, people started attaching these stabilized braces to the backs of AR-15s. And then the question becomes, okay, does that make it a short barreled rifle? And so the ATF's issued a couple of different guidances over the years, basically saying, if you put the brace up to your shoulder and you're holding onto it with two hands, well, that turns it into a short barreled rifle. You are remaking the firearm into a rifle from a pistol. But the brace itself does not make the gun a short barreled rifle.
Okay.
Now the ATF has come out with this worksheet that every brace owner is supposed to fill out and figure out if the ATF would consider their brace to turn their pistol into a short-barreled rifle. And if the answer is probably so, because there aren't any real hard or fast rules, but if it's likely that the ATF would consider that firearm now to be a brace, or consider that a firearm to be a short-barreled rifle with that brace attached, they have a couple of options. They can either permanently attach that brace to their handgun, and they can register it as a short-barreled rifle under the National Firearms Act, or they can destroy or get this, or they can run the risk of a felony charge if they're discovered with the brace and the gun. Huh. The National Shooting Sports Foundation estimates there's somewhere between 10 and 40 million stabilizing braces out there. So, right. They're fairly common. Mm-hmm. And this is a real reversal of what the ATF has said for decades. So obviously, there are a lot of gun owners who are very concerned here, and there's going to be a legal challenge to this. Yeah. We can get into that too if you want.
Yeah, the bump stock ban was struck down recently. Do you think that's where we're going with this one?
It's a little bit different, but I think so. And I think it's part and parcel of a strategy on the part of the ATF and their allies in the gun control movement, right? To try to rewrite the law through a government agency rather than a vote by Congress, right? And to see what the courts will let them get away with. And as you said, the Fifth Circuit looked at that bump stock ban where the ATF said that this, a piece of plastic basically with no moving parts is a machine gun.
Right.
And said, No, I mean, under no reading of the law can that be a machine gun. So now you're actually creating law. That's Congress's job. If they wanted to ban bump stocks, they could, but it's not up to the ATF to do so.
Right.
That's going to be one of the arguments that's made here, right? That this is a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, that these are sort of arbitrary and capricious rules. And in fact, the ATF, in issuing this rule, redefines a rifle. Now they argue that they've got the authority to do that under the Gun Control Act, but this is really, I think, got to boil down to a question of how much wiggle room is the court going to give the ATF in writing regulations versus crafting a law. And I don't think this particular Supreme Court is really going to cut them a lot of slack.
Probably not, but that's what I kept asking myself was how can a bureaucratic agency like the ATF, who are not elected officials, just simply mandate that these stabilizing braces be banned without any act of Congress? It's just bizarre to me, but these are bureaucrats.
And that is the argument, right? That this is overreach. And, look, I mean, we just saw Matt Gaetz's bill to abolish the ATF, and that's great. It's red meat for the base. We know it's not going anywhere.
Right.
From a pragmatic point of view, it actually would be nice for Republicans in Congress to introduce a bill that would, I think, maybe, reestablish some boundaries for the ATF within the confines of the Gun Control Act. Maybe, spell out some definitions, provide some definitions so that they can't try to abuse their authority quite as much. Look, that might not be as red meat for the base, but it's more pragmatic. It might not have any more chance of success in the Senate either. But if nothing else, I think it would serve to highlight this strategy that we're going to see from the Biden administration over the next couple of years. They can't get their gun control through Congress, so they're going to try to impose it as much as they can through the ATF.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Obama did basically the same thing during his years. Whatever he couldn't get through Congress, he just used, the agencies, the bureaucrats, basically to do his bidding. Hey, let's move on to Governor Pritzker. This guy recently signed into law an assault weapons ban. And I'm just curious if you could explain how the law in Illinois defines assault weapon, because most of us know that's a made up word. It doesn't mean anything, not that I've ever known, other than when Congress and Joe Biden banned it back in the 90s.
Yeah, it's fairly broad, right? It encompasses not quite all, but I would say the vast majority of centerfire semi-automatic rifles. Yeah. And most semi-automatic, probably the vast majority of semi-automatic shotguns, some semi-automatic handguns as well, depending on their features, right? So if it has like a threaded barrel, so you can attach a suppressor, I believe that's considered a quote unquote assault weapon under the legislation. It's also got a weird definition of a large capacity magazine, which is another invented term. Right? When does a magazine reach large capacity as opposed to standard capacity? And it depends on what state you're in. Right. So in New York, it's no more than 10 rounds. In Colorado, it's no more than 20. In Illinois now, it's weird. For a handgun, I believe it's no more than 12 rounds. And for a rifle, it's no more than 10. Okay. So they don't even have a standard definition of large capacity. Right. There are variations depending on what type of firearm we're talking about. I mean, you're right. These are all invented terms. I've always said that the real definition of assault weapon is gun they want to ban. And we actually did just see a quote unquote assault weapons ban introduced in Massachusetts that defines assault weapon as every semi-automatic rifle and shotgun. That's it. All of them. I'm surprised they didn't throw in semi-automatic handguns too, to be honest. But that is the definition. And that is, I think, their ultimate goal, right? To ban as many guns as possible by labeling them assault weapons.
Right.
So that's what we're seeing here in Illinois. And so under this law, no sales, no manufacture, existing owners have 300 days to register their existing assault weapons with the state police. Failure to do so is a felony. Meanwhile, if you are caught in possession of a large capacity magazine, that is a misdemeanor offense, which, again, Brett, kind of speaks to, right. That's the silly part of this whole thing. We could talk about this being a constitutional violation, but again, listen, the rhetoric here is these are weapons of war. They don't belong on our streets. They are fueling carnage. and we're going to fine you $750 if we catch you with one. I mean, it makes no sense.
Right.
And it is absolutely laughable to think that, criminals in Chicago care at all about these laws. I just saw a story about they're looking for a robbery crew who's running around with rifles right now after the gun ban's in place. And they're still out there, using rifles to commit violent crimes. They don't care what these laws are. Yeah. Because if you're out there committing armed robbery and you get caught, you're already facing more serious charges, right?
True.
So these laws are meant to dissuade law-abiding gun owners from exercising a constitutional right. And that's why they're not only facing, I think we're up to 4 lawsuits. At least by Friday, we're going to be up to 4 lawsuits. But you've got I think it's something like 9 in 10 sheriffs in Illinois who've said, we're not going to enforce this law.
Yep. Yeah, that was the other thing. It's it's like 80 sheriffs total at this point in Illinois. Edwards County Sheriff Darby Bowe basically just said it's a violation of the Second Amendment and the Constitution. These are inalienable rights. I can't enforce this. So, it's just amazing. I mean, you got an Illinois governor who's banning weapons and also calling for registration, which is sort of like grandfathered. If you got them, you got to register them. You got to let us know who you are. And like you said, I mean, I think they have
and we promise we'll let you keep them once you tell us where they are. Oh, we promise we'll let you keep these battlefield weapons of war that don't belong in our streets. I mean, again, it's absurd. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't get it. I don't even understand how this is going to be enforced, especially if the sheriffs aren't going to be interested. Does that mean the local PD is also going to kind of say, whatever, how do we do this?
It's in some cases that's already happened. You also had state's attorneys that are they're the local prosecutors who said, we're not going to bring charges against anybody for solely, violating this law. And Pritzker is losing his mind. He's melting down. He kind of threatened to remove the sheriffs from office. And I think somebody must have whispered in his ear, you can't do that. Right. You don't have the power, because he hasn't said anything like that since. But, he said they're derelict in their duty. They're not abiding by the wishes of the people of Illinois. And meanwhile, you've got Kim Fox, the prosecutor in Cook County, who said, I'm not going to prosecute low-level drug offenses. That seems to be okay, right?
Yeah.
Apparently Democrats are allowed to use prosecutorial discretion and law enforcement discretion, but Republicans aren't allowed to.
Of course. Do you think this thing's also headed to the courts?
Oh, yeah. So like I said, we've got 2 lawsuits filed in state court. One of them had a hearing on a temporary injunction or a temporary restraining order on Wednesday. Judge says that he'll issue his decision by the end of the day on Friday.
Okay.
And that's challenging the law, not on Second Amendment grounds, but on procedural grounds, basically arguing that the legislature violated its own rules when it passed the law because, I won't get into the legislatee's argument, but again, it's more of a technical challenge.
Interesting.
But then you've got other challenges based on the Second Amendment. You've got one lawsuit filed in federal court already. You've got a second one that should be filed on Friday. And I've heard that there's a third one out there that the NRA might be involved with that will probably drop either Friday or I would say early next week.
Nice.
So, yeah, it is going to court. And within the next few weeks, we'll start seeing these, requests for a restraining order and hopefully a decision from a judge blocking enforcement of the law.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's some good news. So at least there's some good pushback. I predict more meltdowns by Governor Pritzker.
I do too.
So
many more.
So breaking news today, Alec Baldwin will be charged with involuntary manslaughter along with the armorer on the film Rust. And it's interesting, Nick Searcy, who I think we're both friends with, he worked with Nick Cage on The Old Way and had the same armorer. And apparently, according to Nick, she did a very good job. Nick thinks that this was COVID rules that basically kind of changed the way that movies are made. You could only have certain people on the set. The armorer says she was outside while they were filming inside. She wasn't allowed inside. So, it's obviously, COVID kind of turned everything upside down, but what do you think? Do you think this was a case of COVID changing the rules films are made, or do you think it was negligence?
I'm interested to hear that argument, and I'm curious to see if either Baldwin or Hannah Gutierrez Reed makes that case, because we've also heard that there was live ammunition on the set
Mixed in, right?
mixed in, that they were, that they were taking the guns and doing target shooting. Right.
Right.
So it sounds like it wasn't just a case of, protocols not being followed in this one particular instance. It kind of sounds like there was a very lackadaisical attitude towards firearms on the set. Who that extended to, I think, is an open question, right? Yeah. And I don't have that information, but I presume the DA, believes that she's got a case against Baldwin and the armorer. The first assistant director also pled guilty to basically negligent use of a weapon, right. And so avoided, I think, the involuntary manslaughter charge, got a deferred sentence and 6 months probation. Mm-hmm. And I honestly, I'd be really surprised, Brett, if either of these cases go to trial. One of the things the DA said is basically giving the jury two options, to convict on involuntary manslaughter, but to also add a firearm enhancement that would result in a mandatory 5-year sentence. Mm-hmm. If you just saw your colleague walk away with probation, and you're looking at the distinct possibility of 5 years in prison, I think a plea deal, any plea deal that's offered, I think should be seriously considered by Baldwin and Gutierrez-Reed. So We'll see what happens. Honestly, I hesitate to try to offer my opinion on a case before it goes to trial, because there's always so much more that we learn when evidence starts coming out.
That's true.
But I think the burden for Alec Baldwin is going to be that he was holding the gun when it went off. He says, look, it wasn't an actor's job to know whether or not the gun was loaded with blanks or with live ammunition. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like that wasn't a COVID call, right? But to me, as a gun owner, look, I'm not an actor. But as a gun owner, the very first rule of gun safety is assume that the gun is loaded, right? Until you prove otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I have issues with that. And maybe that's going to be, a conundrum that the jury has to wrestle with too. When does an actor holding an actual firearm give up their own responsibility to be safe and responsible with that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I was watching Miami Blues the other day, which is a great late 80s action film with Alec, George Armitage, who also did Grosse Pointe Blank. I mean, this guy's had so much time behind the camera with firearms. In this movie, in the remake of The Getaway, I was really surprised by this one, just considering how many times Alec has been wielding firearms behind the camera.
Well, but again, I think, it also speaks to the fact that there were multiple people who were charged, or at least charged and pled guilty, right? Sure. I don't think that Baldwin bears the sole responsibility here. There was a chain of custody, right? And at some point, and I'm not even sure when the gun was actually loaded with live ammunition, but there were at least 3 people who handled it afterwards, right. None of whom, according to the district attorney, checked to ensure that gun was safe to be on set. So, again, but here's the thing, Brett, you're right that this was shocking. These things don't happen.
Right.
It's not that they happen once a year, once every 2 years. They happen like once every 10 years, right? Yeah. It is an extraordinary set of events that led to Helena Hutchins' death. And so I think, clearly there were some violations. And so maybe that cuts against the COVID theory, because look, there've been a lot of productions going on while COVID's been happening. A lot of them have been using firearms. Yeah. This was the only set where somebody died because a gun discharged with a live round.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. I mean, you got to go back to the 90s with Brandon Lee and The Crow. I think to go back to the last incident, which again, that was shocking back then. But I mean, think about all the movies that have been made where there's real guns and blanks going off. TV shows. It's just crazy. So
yeah, it is
freak accident, man. And I just look at just kind of the environment that movie was being made in. And there was a lot of confusion because a lot of the rules changed on the sets of movies. But at the same time, you got the old way. You got Nick Cage and Nick Searcy doing it with the same armor, and they didn't have any mistakes like this. Nobody died on that set. So yeah, it's bizarre. Well, hey, sadly, we're out of time. Cam, go ahead and give everyone your social media coordinates and where they can find you and your work and your podcast.
Yes, occasionally I pop up on Twitter at Cam Edwards, but that's about the only place that I am on social media. You can find me much more frequently at bearingarms.com. And also be sure to check out Bearing Arms Cam and Company on YouTube and Rumble, all the major podcast platforms. We're talking with Second Amendment newsmakers. We're talking actually today's program or the latest program is with the one of the lead attorneys in one of the many lawsuits taken on the Illinois gun and magazine ban. So there you go.
Nice. Very cool.
And Brett, as always, man, thanks so much for the invite. This has been a lot of fun. I hope I get to come back soon.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you back. You're going to be my go-to gun guy going forward. So this
excellent. I accept that responsibility.
Thanks so much, man. We'll do it again.
All right. Thanks, Brett.